Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The History Blokes. I'm Chris McComb.
And I'm Conan.
And we're here to discuss Australian facts, people and stories we think you ought to know. We're coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, and today we're going to be talking about who I think is Mr. Awesome.
Oh, that's good, because it rhymes and stuff. You want
Fine. So are there any anniversaries that we're celebrating very shortly, Conan?
Chris, this is the 111th anniversary of Douglas Mawson arriving in Antarctica for a remarkable expedition and one of the most remarkable feats of endurance in Antarctic exploration history.
Fantastic.
We're going to learn all about it today.
I'm looking forward to this, Conan, because we've all seen pictures of Mawson, haven't we? Very stoic. It's very impressive. Very impressive,
he used
for
to
sure.
grace the $100 note, didn't he?
He did indeed.
Because Mawson wasn't unlike some of the British explorers of the Antarctic. He was foremost a scientist rather than just a glory seeker.
And there was plenty of those at the time, wasn't there?
There were plenty of those, and many of them came a cropper. Yes, his expeditions were primarily scientific, and their achievements in geology and cartography, meteorology, geomagnetism, and marine biology were groundbreaking. But before we get into that, Chris, inevitably, are we
going to do the quiz?
We're going to do the quiz. We should remind people to like, subscribe, venerate, whatever it is you do, and of course to follow us on Insta, particularly because we're going to be doing some videos soon. It's at History Blokes on Insta, so there's great material there.
We are attempting, like so many other influencers, to put enough material out there to keep people interested.
Yeah, we try to feed the beast.
We certainly
on a regular basis. Speaking of feeding the beast, this quiz is about dogs. For the simple reason that huskies feature in this story of Mawson's expeditions. So, Chris, are you prepared? Are you a fan of dogs?
Yes, I am. I like dogs. But, they say there's dog people and cat people, but I just like both. Indeed, I used to own a husky.
Yes, you did, yeah. That's right.
It was an overweight, elderly, inherited husky.
Yeah.
Wonderful dog, though. So incredibly fluffy. You just wanted to hug it all the time.
Yeah, really? Was it smart?
It was extremely smart. Really smart. I think closer to its primal origins, the wolf, than I think most other animals. That's certainly my impression.
Yes, well, certainly more so than my hound. Okay, so question one. When were dogs domesticated? That's the first part. And when did dingoes arrive here?
Okay, well, I'm going to have a crack at this. I think dogs were domesticated about 100,000 years ago. And in terms of dingoes being brought to Australia, I think it was about 5,000 years ago, in that range.
Yeah, very good. With the second one, terrible with the first one. So dogs were only domesticated about 14,000 years ago. It might have been a bit earlier, but our earliest trace of dog domestication.
I thought it was a little earlier. Okay.
Well, not a little earlier.
Well, I guess you can't argue with Wikipedia. Hey, Conan.
We don't mention that word here.
Indeed.
And dingoes, yes, between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. Aboriginal people brought them to the Australian continent. Yeah. So, dingoes didn't evolve here. So, question two. My dog Charlie is a groodle, which means half golden retriever, half poodle, half bath mat. Our relationship, as you know only too well, is complicated. He's about the size of a golden retriever. His brain is the size of what kind of fruit?
I would suggest a grape.
He behaves like it is, but in fact, full credit to him, it's the size of a mandarin.
Wow. You know, having seen this dog, I still think it's a grape.
Yeah. Yes. I don't think a lot goes on in that mandarin. It's a mandarin functioning at the level of grape. So question three, dingoes replaced what well-known but extinct carnivore as Australia's apex predator?
I'm going to guess that it was originally called the Australian devil.
You're close.
The Tasmanian tiger, I guess,
Yes.
I presume it was more prolific and on the mainland up until then.
Exactly, the thylacine, yeah. So question four, huskies were bred by the Chukchi people living in the Siberian Peninsula. They believe that two huskies guard the gates of heaven and turn away who?
Poodle lovers?
Good guess. People who don't like dogs. That's the answer. Question five, how many muscles do dogs have that move their ears?
Oh, I am literally going to make it up. I'm going to say a dozen.
Close, 18.
Wow.
So that's 18 per ear.
No, it kind of speaks to the character of the dog's ear, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, that's my favourite part of a dog.
Really?
Because I like the way they rotate and they flop and they do stuff. Now, Charlie, our Groodle, his pelt could be put to so many uses. Bath mat, as I was saying. Yep. A friend of mine suggested steering wheel covers.
Oh, I think that's brilliant.
So a little bit about Australia and its relationship with Antarctica. So sealing and whaling quickly became important industries to early European colonists. As the number of animals in Australia's coastal waters were depleted, ships pushed further and further south. And the first Australian to set foot on continental Antarctica was a young Tasmanian physicist called Louis Bernacchi, who landed there in 1895 as part of a Norwegian expedition to explore new whaling grounds. He concluded that, quote-unquote, Antarctic exploration is of capital importance to science. Now, Douglas Mawson was born a few years before that, in 1882, in Yorkshire, but was brought to Sydney when he was 2.
He was the Yorkshire baby.
Yorkshireman, yeah. He studied engineering and geology at uni, conducted geological research in Vanuatu, of all places, the diametric opposite of Antarctica.
I was thinking, you're going, God, it's hot here.
Yes, you know
God,
what I need.
I just want to get out of the heat. And he did.
He did. And in 1985, he was appointed lecturer in mineralogy and petrology at the University of Adelaide. This is your sort of neck of the woods, not literally. I mean, well, yes, Adelaide and uni and stuff. You studied that sort of thing, didn't you?
Indeed, I did. Indeed, I did, for sure.
What did you study again?
So I studied geology and hydrogeology and geophysics.
Right, wow. So
so this is right up my alley, for sure.
Were you trying to follow in the footsteps of Mawson?
I was possibly the worst geology student in the history of Flinders University.
Oh, really?
I literally could not tell granite from clay.
Well, I suppose you don't really need to do a lot of that in Antarctica, because you're quite an adventurous fellow. You've sailed in the Dolphin, as you've mentioned before. You've tried to climb Mont Blanc, failed, but gave it
It was the person I was tied to, thank you very much.
Travelled to more than 50 countries in the world. You've done some pretty hair-raising things. Would you go on an Antarctic expedition?
Hell yeah. That would be amazing. It's a place I've always wanted to go, always.
So in a modern day setting, you'd do it?
In a modern day setting,
Would you do it in 1911?
It depends. Would I do it with Scott? Probably not. Would I do it with his Norwegian competitor, Amundsen? I would probably do it with him.
Would you do it with Mawson?
I'd definitely do it with Mawson.
Do you know the story of Mawson, by the way?
No, I'm familiar with the overarching kind of
your view
concept
on whether to travel with Mawson might change.
well, that's what makes these stories so interesting, Conan.
So in 1907, Mawson met the British Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton, who was visiting Adelaide on his way south to lead the British Antarctic Expedition, or BAE. And Shackleton appointed Mawson the expedition's physicist. Now, as part of the BAE, Mawson was among 6 men who made the first ascent of Mount Erebus, which I think is the highest mountain in Antarctica. Right? He did that in March 1908, and the following year he trekked more than 2,000 k's to claim the South Magnetic Pole for the British nation. It was during this grueling march that he conceived of his own Antarctic expedition. Now, Mawson wanted to carry out a detailed examination of more than 3,000 kilometres of the Antarctic coast and its hinterland, immediately south of Australia. That was his sort of vision. So sure, he was doing it to gather scientific data, but he was also keen on finding any mineral resources that could be exploited. Mawson fleshed out the idea, and while in London in 1910, he talked to Shackleton, who suggested they do it jointly. But Shackleton had to pull out Chris, leaving Mawson to organise it himself and, in effect, make it a purely Australian expedition. In his account of the expedition, called Home of the Blizzard, Mawson wrote, "For many reasons, I was desirous that the expedition should be maintained by Australia. It seemed to me that here was an opportunity to prove that the young men of a young country could rise to those traditions which have made the history of British polar exploration one of triumphant endeavour as well as of tragic sacrifice."
Sterling stuff.
And so I was privileged to rally the sons of the youngest son.
You know what I'm disappointed about? The fact that he travelled, obviously came to Australia when he was 2 years old, because if he'd come a bit later, you'd have to do a Yorkshire accent when you read that out.
Yeah, well, What I'm sad about is that we don't use the word desirous anymore.
I think we should perhaps try to include it in future episodes.
Every episode has to have the word desirous.
I've just spent the last 5 years trying to bring groovy back.
Okay, well, let's make sure the words groovy and desirous are in every episode from now on. People get points at home if they notice and write into us.
You call this the History Blokes Bingo.
Yes.
We don't have any merch to give away yet, do we, Conan?
No, and if they can also identify, we never use the phrase "absolutely extraordinary."
I think it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Oh, absolutely.
Is the combination you're thinking of?
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Well,
brilliant.
I'm the one who edits this. I hear that. Both those phrases are fair. If anyone writes in spotting Chris's phrases, Chris will pay you $50 every time you contact us via Instagram.
In Yap currency. So expect a very, very large stone wheel to come your way.
So the Australasian Antarctic Expedition, AAE, sailed from Hobart for Antarctica in a ship called the Aurora. So a tall ship, sails. It had some kind of engine as well. On the 2nd of December 1911, with a view to returning in early 1913. Now, Mawson's plan required the establishment of 3 bases. So a radio relay station at Quarry Island, which I'd love to go to, it sounds great. A main base at Commonwealth Bay, and another base 2,000 k's west on the Shackleton Ice Shelf. At each base, and in expeditions from them, Mawson and his men would conduct scientific research. There was also going to be an extensive program of marine science that was going to be carried out on the Aurora itself under its captain, John King Davis. So Mawson wisely ensured that among the AAE's members was photographer Frank Hurley, who has left us incredible images and film footage of the expedition. You've heard of Hurley, no doubt, Chris?
I think I have, actually. Certainly seen his images, that's for sure.
He was with Shackleton too. Yeah, so
Shackleton on the Endurance.
Yes.
I think all of us have seen his photos then, I would suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. So in March 1912, 111 years ago, Mawson and his party arrived in Commonwealth Bay. So that's 2,670 k's south of Hobart. And the 18 men spent the autumn and winter building a hut, which they fancifully called Main Base, at a place called Cape Denison, conducting research and preparing for their expeditions in the summer. Now, Chris, 6 parties set out from the base in early November on journeys of varying lengths. Mawson's expedition comprised himself, a British Army officer called Belgrave Ninnis. That's a great name, isn't it?
You know what? I've just changed my name by deed poll to include, forgotten his name, forgotten whatever.
Gwynedd, something like
Gwynedd,
that.
yeah, I've just included Gwynedd as a middle name. I'm going to have to adopt Belgrade. That is fantastic.
That's a great name, yeah. So it was Mawson, Belgrave Ninnis, and a Swiss champion skier called Xavier Mertz. So the 3 of them intended to map the coastline east of Cape Denison. So it's going to be a round trip of 1,500 k's. So pretty substantial. Because you've got to bear in mind too that obviously the gear they had was primitive compared to the sort of stuff we have now. They probably were wearing stuff that was pretty similar to the sort of gear Scott used around at the same time, as compared to the stuff that Amundsen used. So Amundsen being Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, who was the first person to the South Pole. And Scott, of course, being Robert Falcon Scott, the British explorer, and the second person to the pole, but the one who didn't come back. So Amundsen used a wolfskin to keep him warm, whereas the British and Australians were using wool, which is understandable, but it just wasn't as effective. Yes. I'm not saying that's what killed Scott. It was just one of the many ways in which he wasn't quite as prepared as Amundsen.
The British and I guess the Australian expeditions brought to you by Woolmark. You know, it's like
yeah, but I mean that's one of the things, isn't it? Like, why compete with the Norwegians? I mean, it's just like
you are hiding to nothing.
Yeah,
agreed.
And Amundsen he was a machine, that man. He was, it's worth just finding out a bit about his life. Like he dedicated his entire life to polar exploration. Now, a month into the expedition, they'd done 499 k's.
That's a lot of k's.
It's a lot of k's in that,
bloody cold conditions.
And it was at that point that, unfortunately, Ninnis fell into a deep crevasse, taking his sledge and most of their supplies and most of the Huskies with him. And that was it. He just disappeared.
Awful.
Mawson and Mertz were sort of staring into the crevasse and they just couldn't see him or anything connected to him at all.
God, that's terrible. I can barely imagine what was going through their minds at the time.
They didn't have enough rope to even go down and try to rescue him. So, but I mean, the point is, he was almost certainly dead by then anyway, because he had plummeted. I mean, it was an unbelievably deep crevasse. There was no sign of him. So he's still there now, along with the dogs, along with the supplies.
Still there, probably quite preserved too, I suspect.
Perfectly preserved, yeah.
Very grim.
Yeah.
Very grim.
That's what happens when you stumble around in the Antarctic. Now Mertz was a good friend of Ninnis's, and this is what he wrote in his journal. We could do nothing, really nothing. We were standing helplessly next to a friend's grave, my best friend of the whole expedition. We read a prayer in Mawson's prayer book. This was our only consolation, the last honouring we could do for our beloved friend Ninnis.
Yeah, it's moving, really. I mean, absolutely moving.
Because they would have been standing there in the middle of nowhere. I don't know what sort of conditions. I don't think they were necessarily terrible at that stage. But obviously, the Antarctica is forbidding. They would have felt incredibly isolated. And also, no doubt, pretty alarmed because they didn't really have enough to get back.
Well, they've lost all their supplies.
Not all of them, but most. So they've been out a month. So it's presumably going to take the same amount of time to get back. It began their return to base, but they only had 10 days of food. So as they went, they were forced to eat all of their beloved dogs. This is what Mawson wrote in his journal.
Fluffy and Bonnie. And...
Well, what he said was, that night we ate George.
Oh, no, he named them as he consumed them.
Well, not as he consumed them. That's asking for trouble. I'm going to name this nameless dog George just before I devour him. No, he was so he said, that night we ate George. He was a very poor sample, chiefly sinews with a very undesirable taste. It was a happy relief when the liver appeared, which, if little else could be said in its favour, could be easily chewed and digested.
Oh, that's not palatable. Not palatable at all, but it did the trick, clearly.
What was the name of your husky, Chris?
Simone.
And how did it die?
Old age.
Yeah, sure. Now, the problem was that Mertz and Mawson were unaware that animals' livers contain toxic levels of vitamin A.
Well, they are kind of like the filter of your body, aren't they?
Yeah. But there's some livers you can eat.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
But certainly dogs' livers avoid, is my suggestion. So I hope you did. When you devoured Simone, I hope you avoided the liver. Yeah, I'm sure you just focused on the toothsome haunch. So it's thought that this contributed to the deterioration of both men, in particular Mertz.
Okay, so talking about huskies, right, and the consumption of huskies, Amundsen actually took 52 huskies out with him.
Really?
Right?
To the South Pole.
To the South Pole. He returned with 11. Amundsen spoke grandly of the consumption of huskies on his way back to base.
Developed a taste.
He did develop a taste, and on top of that, they returned to home base healthy, and indeed they had put on weight, which I think is
really?
They had put on weight, according to my sources, and it is not Wikipedia. They had actually put on some pounds, which I think is extraordinary.
So you think the South Pole, discovering the South Pole was a bonus?
Indeed.
Having a sort of prolonged husky picnic was the main purpose.
It was sheer gluttony.
When they left base and a day into the trip had devoured 10.
That's right.
So Mertz died on the 8th of January 1913, and Mawson wrote in his book, outside, the bowl of chaos was brimming with drift snow, and as I lay in the sleeping bag beside my dead companion, I wondered how, in such conditions, I would manage to break and pitch camp single-handed. There appeared to be little hope of reaching the hut, as in main base, still 100 miles away. Are you sure you want to travel with Mawson now?
No, I don't.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break here and listen to your intermission. What have you got for us, Chris?
All right, Conan. Well, there's a lot to talk about when we talk about Antarctica, of course. So I'll start out with a few little facts and figures, I suppose. I don't know. Do you know much about Antarctica?
Oh, not really. Okay. I know it's the driest continent. Yeah. The ice is, I don't know, many kilometres thick.
It's also the windiest continent, which is really interesting. Right. And quite clearly, it's the lowest recorded temperature on Earth, minus 89 degrees.
Wow.
It's the highest continent. Okay, and what I mean by that, the average elevation is 2,200 metres above sea level.
Oh.
But you take all the ice away, it's about 400 metres
Oh, really?
on average. So it's a huge amount of ice. And that amount of ice actually weighs down on the continent itself, which is interesting. If you removed all the ice, the actual continent would rebound up. We're seeing this in Nordic countries where glaciation finished some 10,000 years ago. Yeah. And every year, Sweden is rising, for example. Really? And it's called isostatic rebound, which is pretty interesting. Wow. Anyway, and a lot of people have this impression that Antarctica is kind of this enormous kind of continent covered in ice and everything else. That's true, but it's not actually so big. They've done some recent geophysical surveys and so on. And whilst, it's really quite a small continent with a large archipelago of islands. So if you were to sort of remove all the ice, it would actually be much smaller than most people think. Right. And, we have Antarctica to thank for our extensive knowledge around meteorites, of course, as well. Because you know how bloody hard it is to find ancient meteorites. Well, it's pretty easy to find them, of course, when they're all just sitting there on the ice. The South and North Pole flip.
Oh, yeah.
They actually flip. It might take 1,000. No one's really sure about how fast or slow these events go. The magnetic pole. If it was the axis of the planet, that would be dire for all of us. And it is a little bit dire when the magnetic poles flip as well, because that magnetic field that surrounds the Earth is our shield against solar radiation, effectively, which is why you get all those nice auroras at the south, the very south and the north and so on, because the magnetic field really directs that radiation both around the solar winds around the planet, but also there's an element of that, of course, that channels through to the North and South Pole, which is fascinating. And, of course, the danger is, during these pole flips, we lose our protection during that period.
For how long?
We don't know. Oh. We don't know.
So that could be the thing that gets us.
No, it could be. It could be.
And it could happen at any time.
It could. We just don't know how. It could be really quick. It might not be quick. We just don't know.
Wouldn't it be ironic if we were wiped out by something that wasn't self-inflicted? So it wasn't ozone layer, it wasn't global warming.
The ozone layer would probably play a part. But yeah, that's exactly right. Look, we're probably due for a flip, I think. Yay. We're probably not far away.
Chris, thank you for that. Let's have a little bit of Mozart and we return to Mawson. Okay, so Chris, we left poor Douglas Mawson. He had lost the second of his two companions, and he was still 100 miles from the base hut. At this point, he threw away everything except his journal and his geological specimens, which is testament.
Kept his woolly hat, I hope.
His balaclava. He cut his sledge in half. Nonetheless, it took another 30 days to man-haul the sledge to base. His survival only made possible by stumbling across small food depots left by a search party. But he was falling apart physically, as you can imagine.
Gosh, can you imagine
30 days?
That 30 days going, I don't know if I'm going to make it back. The endurance of someone to do that is just...
Yeah, it's remarkable.
It is remarkable.
We get to this in a second. It wasn't just that, I have to get to the base camp. There's a time limit.
Is it because winter was coming? No, that is not a Game of Thrones reference, but it might be.
Well, yes, in effect it was. And in fact, a blizzard trapped him in an ice cave for a week.
A week sitting in an ice cave?
Yeah, just trying to keep sane. And not knowing when the blizzard is going to end.
And,
of course,
trying to not freeze to death.
Another occasion he fell into a crevasse and was only saved because the sledge got stuck in a snowdrift on the surface.
Could you imagine being absolutely exhausted, fatigued, and then sliding into a crevasse, so hanging on a rope attached to your sled, and then hauling yourself out of that completely and utterly exhausted?
Yeah.
That is unimaginable.
Yeah, it is. So, he had to climb up 5 meters of rope to safety, sick still from the vitamin A poisoning.
Thank God there were no more huskies to eat.
That's right, yeah, that could
have done him in.
Yeah. Now, the time issue was because Mawson knew that the Aurora would have arrived to relieve the base at Commonwealth Bay, his destination. His main worry was that he had to get back prior to the ship being forced to leave in time to pick up the men at the western base before the winter pack ice closed in. And in fact, his concerns were well founded. Davis, the captain of the Aurora, had delayed his departure for as long as possible from Commonwealth Bay, but as Mawson staggered towards the base, he was greeted with the dispiriting sight of the Aurora sailing off into the distance.
Oh, come on. This has obviously got to be one of those just-in-time stories. That is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's why they should make this into a film. Well, you were saying they have made it into a film, but this should be
might have been
like
a documentary or
a
something.
major feature film.
Yes.
It's extraordinary. Now, happily, he then, having seen the ship sail off, he then glimpsed the 6 men who had remained behind on the off chance he should turn up. He and his party would turn up.
They stayed behind it to perhaps sit through the next couple of months.
Not couple of months, 10 months. So they had to overwinter before they could be picked up again for 10 months.
Now, that is dedication.
That is
I mean, especially back in those days, you'd be thinking, God, I just want to go home.
Yeah.
I've been freezing myself silly here for a while, and I just want to go. I've been here for years. Am I going to stay here for another year on the hope that this guy's he's already probably dead out there in the ice, is going to come home?
Yeah, I mean,
it's amazingly dedicated.
He was, definitely running late, and there was every reason to think he would have died, but I guess they just couldn't bring themselves to leave him. So, they remained in the hut for the next 10 months. Mawson wrote his account of the expedition while the 7 men as a whole largely succeeded in keeping sane through continuing their scientific work, establishing occasional radio contact with the outside world, and they even published a monthly newspaper called the Daily Blizzard. I mean, can you imagine what would be in that newspaper every month? Oh my God.
More bloody snow, dark.
And I think one of them actually sort of did lose his mind, actually. Yeah. So things got a bit grim for one guy. I mean, as you can imagine, that's cabin fever at the most.
Would have been like minus 60 outside or something like that.
And it wouldn't have been dark for the entire time, but obviously for a fair chunk of it.
Actually, I can picture the headline every month. Why didn't he get back 15 minutes earlier? and then we could have all these opinion pieces on why he didn't get back 15 minutes earlier before the ship had departed.
Yeah. I mean, every day you'd wake up and think, oh my God, more sun! Anyway, in terms of the legacy of the expedition, the AAE was the first major scientific expedition by Australians beyond their shores. It explored some 6,347 k's of mainland Antarctica as well as Macquarie Island. The analysis and report of the scientific data collected during the expedition was so extensive that it wasn't until 1947 that they were finally published in 22 volumes. I'm going to quote from a bloke called David Killick, who wrote in the Australian Antarctic magazine. I assume you subscribe to that, Chris?
Seriously, it's one of the periodicals I will not let go of.
No, along with your Daily Blizzard.
Indeed.
So this sums up his achievement. It says, in the course of science, the men of the AAE quietly made breakthroughs in Antarctic geology, biology, meteorology, magnetism, and oceanography. The expedition sent sledging parties across 2,600 miles of unknown country, and the Aurora sailed 3,000 kilometres of unmapped coastline. The party used radio successfully for the first time on the continent. Daily observations of temperature, barometric pressure, humidity, snowfall, wind speed and direction. Daily magnetic and tide observations hard won against the cold and wind. And Frank Hurley produced more than 2,500 magnificent still images and a documentary film. So after the expedition, Mawson returned to Australia and was knighted and received many honours throughout his life. During the First World War, he worked with the British Ministry of Munitions and the Russian Military Commission. While he was doing that, many of the men who took part in the expedition died in the trenches of the First World War. Because, of course,
it's all very sad.
Yeah, because they got back just in time to go off to fight. After the war, he became Professor of Geology and Mineralogy at Adelaide University. Is that how you pronounce it?
That is correct. And they still, to this day, have the Mawson Chair.
Right, okay. And in 1929 and 1930, he led joint Australian, British and New Zealand expeditions to the Antarctic. And these led to the creation of the Australian Antarctic Territory in 1936, which I think constitutes 42% of the continent.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I should say, back to my earlier reference, it's the land side. All the other guys get the archipelago.
Oh, right, really?
Yeah, indeed.
Oh, okay. Is ours the largest?
Yes.
And apparently he absolutely loathed the indiscriminate seal and penguin slaughter that he witnessed on his 1930 expedition. And this informed his advice to the Tasmanian government to declare Macquarie Island a wildlife sanctuary. He also lobbied passionately for the federal government to create ongoing Australian Antarctic expeditions, which of course continue to this day. So he died in 1958, and the hut at Commonwealth Bay remains largely intact, as you would imagine.
Quite well preserved. And I think they've got a replica, don't they, in Hobart?
Oh, do they?
The Mawson's hut.
In a museum or something?
No, it's just sitting out there in the open down near the harbour there. Okay. It's kind of like a museum and situ thing, something like that.
It'd be pretty cool to visit.
Either
one of those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris, that's it for Mawson. Are you excited about the prospect of our next episode, which will be about the invention of the black box flight recorder?
I think that's a fact that most people are probably not aware of. It's not common knowledge. A game-changing Australian invention. I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, look forward to bringing key learnings to you then, Chris. In the meantime, thanks for listening and goodbye to everyone until next time.
Indeed. Have a great couple of weeks.
See you later. Bye-bye.